Imagine a map with no borders, no names, and no masters, only a silent, breathing titan of a continent. For eons, this land was a fortress of isolation, 3,000 miles of jagged peaks, sun-scorched prairies, and prehistoric forests, guarded by the two most violent oceans on Earth. Today, we call it the United States, a global hegemon that dictates the pulse of modern civilization. But how did a collection of starving outcasts and scattered tribes transform a wilderness into the most formidable nation-state in human history? The truth is far more chaotic than the legends we are told. It is a story of impossible gambles, brutal contradictions, and a recurring cycle of near extinction. We are taught that this nation was born from a bright idea, but in reality, it was forged in a furnace of survival. As we peel back the layers of time, we find a haunting paradox that remains true today. The very forces that built this superpower are the same ones that have repeatedly brought it to the edge of the abyss. The journey of the United States does not begin with a document or a flag. It begins with the dirt, the rivers, and the stone. Geography is the silent architect of destiny, and in North America, the architecture was both a divine blessing and a geographical curse. To the east, the Appalachian Mountains stood like a jagged, emerald wall, trapping the first settlers in a narrow, claustrophobic strip of coastal land. This confinement was a crucible. It forced them to build dense, connected societies and maritime economies, but it also bred a deep, simmering frustration. To the west, the Rockies formed an even more terrifying barrier, a wall of rock and ice that whispered of an infinite, unreachable frontier. But the true engine of American power lay hidden in the center, the Mississippi River system. This massive, liquid highway offered a level of internal connectivity that no other continent on Earth possessed. It allowed resources to flow like blood through the veins of a giant, creating the wealthiest internal market in history. Yet, this geographical wealth created a dangerous illusion of invulnerability. Protected by the Atlantic and the Pacific, the nascent nation felt it could ignore the world. But this isolation was a double-edged sword. The vastness that offered infinite wealth also created a deep, permanent sense of disconnection. People separated by thousands of miles of wilderness began to view themselves as different species of citizens, sowing the seeds of a division that would one day turn the soil red. What looked like a fortress of safety was, in fact, a pressure cooker of internal conflict. Long before the first European ship appeared like a pale ghost on the horizon, this continent was a vibrant tapestry of complex civilizations. 15,000 years ago, during the dying gasps of the last ice age, the first humans crossed a bridge of ice and bone from Siberia. These were not mere wanderers. They were the ultimate survivors, the vanguard of a new world. Imagine a lone hunter in the late Pleistocene, standing on a frozen ridge in what is now New Mexico. The air is thin, biting, and smells of ancient dust. He tracks a mammoth, not for glory, but because the survival of his entire clan, every child, every elder, depends on a single, perfectly placed spear throw. This was a life defined by the rawest terms of existence. Over millennia, these peoples, from the Mississippian mound builders to the desert-dwelling ancestral Puebloans, created trade networks that rivaled those of ancient Rome. In the great city of Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, thousands of people lived in a sophisticated urban center with towering earthen pyramids, centuries before a single brick was laid in colonial Virginia. Their daily life was a rhythmic, spiritual dance with the land they did not claim to own, but rather to inhabit. They were the first to learn the land's harshest lesson. In America, nature does not negotiate. When the climate shifted or the soil failed, entire civilizations vanished into the dust, leaving only silent mounds and whispers behind. By the early 1600s, the silence of the continent was shattered forever. The arrival of European powers was not a peaceful settlement. It was a violent collision of worlds, a biological and cultural shockwave that decimated 90% of the indigenous population before a single shot was even fired. The English, the French, and the Spanish did not see a home. They saw a ledger of resources to be extracted. Power began to form in the damp, fever-ridden marshes of Jamestown and the unforgiving, rocky shores of Plymouth. In these early colonies, survival was a daily miracle. Imagine the winter of 1609 in Jamestown, known as the starving time, where men were driven to eat their boots and, in some cases, each other. This was the dark, bloody soil in which the American character was planted. People obeyed the colonial governors not out of loyalty to a king 3,000 miles away, but out of a desperate, primal need for protection against the unknown. Tension was the only constant. There was tension between the settlers and the indigenous people whose land was being swallowed, tension between the different religious factions who hated each other as much as they feared the wilderness, and most dangerously, tension between the colonies and the distant crown. The British Empire saw the colonies as a piggy bank. The colonists, hardened by the frontier and radicalized by the Enlightenment, began to see themselves as something entirely new. They were no longer just English subjects, they were a hybrid people, forged by the musket and the plow. By the 1770s, the pressure had become unbearable. The colonies were growing too large for their shackles, and the crown was tightening its grip. The stability of the British Atlantic was a mask. Underneath, a fire was smoldering, fueled by a raw, frontier desire for self-determination. But this system was already breaking, and no one could stop what came next. The American Revolution was the first great existential gamble, a war that by all logic, the colonists should have lost. This was not just a war, it was survival in its most naked form. In the winter of 1776, the entire dream of independence nearly died in the frozen, stinking mud of New Jersey. Picture a young soldier standing on the banks of the Delaware River on Christmas night. His boots are rotting rags, his feet are bleeding into the snow, and his musket is rusted. He isn't fighting for a grand constitutional theory. He's fighting because he has been pushed to the edge of the world and has nowhere else to run. The victory at Yorktown didn't end Oppos. Just end a war. It birthed a profound paradox. A nation founded on the universal principle of liberty, yet economically and socially tethered to the brutal reality of enslavement. This contradiction was a ticking time bomb buried deep in the foundation of the new republic. For the next 80 years, the nation expanded with a frantic, almost manic energy. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the country overnight, turning the United States into a continental empire before it had even learned how to be a nation. But as they moved west, the question of who would control the new land, and whether that land would be free or slave, became a poison that seeped into every debate, every election, and every home. Unity built the nation, but it also nearly destroyed it. The mid-19th century brought the most terrifying moment in the American story, the Civil War. It was the moment the heart of the nation literally tore in half, a fratricidal slaughter that remains the bloodiest conflict in U.S. history. This wasn't Oppos, a war of professional armies. It was a war of brothers, neighbors, and fathers. At the Battle of Shiloh, the air was so thick with lead that it mowed down peach blossoms like snow, covering the thousands of dying men in a deceptive, haunting beauty. The psychological fracture was total. Imagine a mother in Kentucky who had one son wearing Union blue and another wearing Confederate gray, both marching toward the same slaughterhouse. It was a visceral, industrial-scale carnage that forced the country to finally decide what it actually was. Was it a collection of sovereign states, or was it a single, indivisible nation? When the dust settled at Appomattox, the United States had survived, but the old, agrarian world was dead. In its place, a steel and steam monster was rising. The trauma of the war didn't end Oppos, disappear. It simply went underground, fueling a new, aggressive drive toward industrialization and westward conquest. The frontier was declared closed, and the indigenous nations were crushed under the wheels of the locomotive and the repeating rifle. The nation had found its soul, but it had paid for it with an ocean of blood. The Gilded Age followed, a period of glittering, obscene wealth and staggering, systemic poverty. Massive factories rose like cathedrals of soot and iron in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Detroit, fueled by a new wave of millions of immigrants. These people, fleeing famine in Ireland, pogroms in Russia, and poverty in Italy, stood in the long shadow of the Statue of Liberty with nothing but hope and a willingness to sweat until they bled. This was the era of the Titan, Men like Rockefeller and Carnegie held more power than kings, while children worked 12-hour shifts in coal mines. What looked like strength was already decay. The divide between the robber barons and the working class grew into a canyon that threatened to swallow the country whole. Labor strikes became small wars. The streets of American cities were often battlegrounds between Pinkerton guards and desperate workers. This internal pressure was only relieved by the sudden, violent arrival of the 20th century, which forced the United States out of its shell and onto the world stage. 2 world wars transformed the United States from an isolated regional power into the arsenal of democracy. But this transformation was not a choice. It was a survival response to a world on fire. The most profound human moment of this entire century occurred in the silent desert of New Mexico in July 1945. A group of the world's most brilliant scientists stood in the pre-dawn dark, watching a countdown. When the first atomic bomb detonated at the Trinity site, the light was brighter than 1,000 suns, turning the desert sand into glass. In that terrifying instant, the United States achieved ultimate power, but it also inherited an ultimate, soul-crushing burden. It had become the guarantor of global order, the only thing standing between civilization and nuclear annihilation. The Cold War that followed was a 40-year twilight struggle where the entire world held its breath. Domestically, the nation faced another internal reckoning. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a second revolution, a demand that the country finally live up to the promises made by the Founding Fathers. Imagine a woman named Rosa sitting on a bus in Montgomery, or a preacher standing before 250,000 people in the shadow of Lincoln, his voice shaking the very pillars of the Capitol. These were not just political acts. They were attempts to heal the original sin of the nation's founding. Progress is often just another word for scars. The transition into the modern era was messy, painful, and deeply uncertain. The technological revolution of the late 20th century turned the world into a digital village, with the United States as its town square. Silicon Valley became the new frontier, replacing the gold mines of the Old West with the infinite data mines of the Internet. But as the nation became more connected to the world, it seemed to become more disconnected from itself. The old geographical barriers, the mountains and rivers that once defined American life, no longer mattered in a world of instant communication. Yet, the psychological barriers returned with a vengeance. The wealth gap widened to levels not seen since the Gilded Age, and the cultural consensus that held the country together during the Cold War began to evaporate. The United States now stands as a global titan, its economy and military influence unparalleled in the history of empires. But look closely at the cracks in the marble, and you will see the historical patterns still at play. The same tensions that haunted the early colonies, the debate over the role of government, the struggle for racial equity, and the deep divide between the urban centers and the rural heartland, are still the primary drivers of American life. As we look back across the millennia, from the first hunter tracking a mammoth across a bridge of ice to the engineer launching a billionaire's rocket toward the red dust of Mars, the story of this nation is not one of steady, inevitable progress. It is a story of explosive, violent growth followed by agonizing, near-fatal corrections. It is the story of a people who were consumed by a wild land until they learned how to master it, only to realize that mastery comes with a heavy, existential price. The United States has always been a grand, dangerous experiment, a place where the most radical ideas of humanity are tested in the harshest possible conditions. It has nearly collapsed a dozen times, and each time, it has reinvented itself into something unrecognizable to the previous generation. But history is not a straight line. It is a circle that tightens with every passing decade. The challenges of the past, survival, identity, and the responsible use of power, are the challenges of this very moment. We are still that hybrid people, forged by a wilderness that no longer exists but remains etched in our spirit. The modern nation-state is a towering achievement, a monument to human will and ingenuity. But monuments can crumble if the people forget the cost of the foundation. So the question is no longer how nations rise, but how they survive what comes after.